There is a moment before dawn when the world is completely still. No traffic, no aircraft, no machinery, no human sound of any kind, just the earth breathing in the particular silence that exists only in those few minutes before the light begins. In that silence, if you know how to listen, you can sometimes hear something else, not a sound exactly, more like an absence, the negative space left by something that was once here and is no longer, a presence defined by its removal. The way a room feels different after someone has just left it, even though nothing visible has changed. The dinosaurs have been gone for 66 million years. 66 million years. That number is so large it resists comprehension. The entire history of human civilization, from the first cities of Mesopotamia to the present moment, occupies approximately 6,000 years. The dinosaurs were gone for 11,000 times that span before the first human being ever walked upright on the African savanna. And yet, their bones are in our museums. Their footprints are in our rocks. Their descendants are in our skies. Because the birds that you hear singing at dawn are not merely related to dinosaurs in some loose, metaphorical sense. They are dinosaurs, the direct, lineal, biologically continuous descendants of the same animals that shook the Jurassic Earth with their footsteps. The dinosaurs did not disappear, they transformed. This is not a story about monsters. That is the version you have already seen. The roaring, the running, the implausible escapes down corridors. That version has been told so many times in so many formats, with so much technical sophistication and so little actual interest in what the animals really were, that it has become its own kind of myth. This is a different story. This is the story of what the age of dinosaurs actually was, what the world looked like, what the air smelled like, what the light was like, what a day in the Jurassic or the Cretaceous actually contained beyond the moment of predation that always gets the close-up. This is the story of how dinosaurs lived, not just how they died. This is the story of 165 million years of life on Earth, the longest successful tenancy in the history of complex animals, told from the inside. To understand the dinosaurs, you must first understand what came before them, because the world the dinosaurs inherited was not the world we know. It was not even remotely similar to the world we know. It was a world so alien that if you could step into it, you would recognize almost nothing. Not the plants, not the animals, not the arrangement of the continents, not the composition of the atmosphere. Go back 252 million years. This is the Permian-Triassic boundary, the moment in geological time that paleontologists call the Great Dying, the most catastrophic mass extinction in the history of complex life on Earth. Something happened at this boundary. The precise nature of that something is still debated. A combination of massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia, the Siberian traps, releasing carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide in quantities sufficient to acidify the oceans and destabilize the atmosphere. The warming of global temperatures by perhaps 10 to 15 degrees. The deoxygenation of the deep oceans. And possibly other factors that the geological record has not yet fully revealed. Whatever the precise mechanism, the result was catastrophic beyond anything that has happened before or since. 96% of all marine species went extinct. 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species went extinct. The insects, the most resilient of the terrestrial animals, suffered their only mass extinction in the entire fossil record. The coal forests of the Carboniferous period had already been replaced by different vegetation in the Permian, but even that later Permian ecosystem was now largely gone. The reefs that had populated the Permian seas, complex communities of corals and sponges and fish and mollusks, vanished so completely that reef ecosystems did not recover their former complexity for 10 million years. The Earth, in the aftermath of the Great Dying, was nearly empty. Nearly, but not quite. Some things survived. The survivors were not necessarily the most complex or the most sophisticated organisms of the Permian world. They were the ones that happened to be in the right place with the right metabolic tolerances at the right moment, the ones whose particular combination of biology and circumstance allowed them to persist through conditions that killed almost everything else. Among the survivors were a group of small, relatively obscure reptiles called archosaurs, the ruling reptiles, a broad group that would eventually give rise to both the crocodilians and the dinosaurs. In the immediate aftermath of the Permian extinction, the archosaurs were not dominant. The early Triassic world was populated by a variety of surviving groups competing to fill the ecological roles that the extinction had vacated. Therapsids, the synapsids that were the ancestors of mammals, were among the survivors, and in the earliest Triassic, they were common and diverse. But over the course of the Triassic period, the roughly 50 million years that followed the Great Dying, the archosaurs gradually came to dominate. And within the archosaurs, one particular lineage began to develop a set of characteristics that would eventually produce something entirely new. A different way of standing, a different way of moving, a different way of being a large animal in the world. The first dinosaurs appear in the fossil record approximately 230 million years ago in the late Triassic period. They were not at this point dominant. They were one group among many, relatively small, bipedal or capable of bipedal locomotion, active and probably fast-moving by the standards of their contemporaries. But they had something in their anatomy, the specific arrangement of their hip joints, the way their legs were positioned directly beneath their bodies rather than sprawling out to the sides in the manner of lizards and crocodilians, that made them more energetically efficient, capable of sustained locomotion in ways that their contemporaries were not. And when the next extinction came, the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event, approximately 201 million years ago, the dinosaurs were again among the survivors. And this time, when they emerged from the aftermath, there was almost nothing left to compete with them. The Jurassic world belonged to the dinosaurs. Close your eyes and try to imagine the Jurassic. Not the Jurassic of popular imagination, not the theme park, not the CGI landscape of endless ferns and thundering sauropods under a perpetually overcast sky. The real Jurassic. The first thing you need to understand is the light. The Jurassic sun was the same sun that shines today, the same star, at approximately the same stage of its development, producing approximately the same spectrum of radiation. But what that radiation fell upon was different. There were no flowering plants in the Jurassic. The angiosperms, the flowering plants that today dominate virtually every terrestrial ecosystem on Earth, that produce the fruits and flowers and grasses that feed most of the world's animals, did not yet exist. The Jurassic world was a world of gymnosperms, conifers, cycads, ginkgos, and the extinct relatives of these modern groups. This means that the Jurassic landscape had no flowers, no grass. The ground cover in open areas was ferns, a vast diversity of ferns, many of them now extinct, covering the forest floor, and the open areas between tree stands in a dense, deep green carpet that would be immediately recognizable as fern, but unlike any specific fern you have seen. The trees were enormous conifers, relatives of the modern Araucaria, the monkey puzzle tree, and the Norfolk Island pine, whose straight trunks rose 20, 30, 40 meters before branching, creating a forest canopy that filtered the light into a particular quality. Green-tinged, filtered through gymnosperm needles rather than the broad leaves of modern trees, producing a different texture of shadow and light than any modern forest offers. Cycads filled the understory, palm-like plants with thick, armored trunks and crowns of stiff, deep green fronds, producing cones rather than flowers. Ginkgos, whose closest modern relative, Ginkgo biloba, is one of the oldest surviving tree lineages on Earth, grew widely across the Jurassic landscape, their distinctive fan-shaped leaves recognizable to anyone who has seen the modern tree. The color palette of the Jurassic landscape was consequently different from what we see today. No yellows and pinks and reds and purples of flowering plants, mostly greens and the grey-brown of bark and the particular reddish-orange of weathered rock. In autumn, when the ginkgos dropped their leaves, there would have been gold. Ginkgo leaves turn a brilliant yellow before falling. The smell of the Jurassic would have been extraordinary by our standards. The terpene compounds released by gymnosperm trees, the smell of resin and pine on a vast scale, combined with the ancient smell of fern and the distinctive chemical signatures of unfamiliar plant species. Clean in a world without industrial pollution. Sharp in the way that conifer-dominated forests are always sharp. The temperature of the Jurassic Earth was significantly warmer than today's. There were no polar ice caps, the poles were ice-free, and the global average temperature was perhaps 5 to 10 degrees Celsius higher than the present. This warmth was not uniform. There were seasons, temperature gradients between the poles and the equator, variations with altitude and with proximity to the ocean. But the world was warmer, and that warmth allowed biological productivity at latitudes that today are too cold for lush vegetation. The continents were not where they are today. In the early Jurassic, the supercontinent Pangaea, the assembly of all the world's land masses into a single great continent that had formed over hundreds of millions of years, was beginning to break apart. The Atlantic Ocean was just beginning to open, a narrow seaway between what would become North America and what would become Africa and Europe. The southern supercontinent Gondwana, which included what would become South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India, was still largely intact. This geography meant that animals could, in principle, travel between what are now widely separated continents. The same dinosaur species, or very closely related ones, appear in the Jurassic fossil record of North America and Europe and Africa, reflecting the partial connectivity of the Jurassic world. Into this world, this warm, green, gymnosperm-dominated, flower-free, grass-free world, the dinosaurs expanded. And what they became in that expansion was extraordinary. There is a question that every child asks, and that every paleontologist has spent at least some time thinking about seriously. How big? How big did the dinosaurs actually get? Not in the movies, not in the illustrations in children's books, but in biological reality. What was the maximum size that an animal made of flesh and bone and muscle and nerve could actually reach? The answer, based on the fossil record, is larger than you probably think. And the reasons why they could be that large tell us something profound about the biology of these animals and the world they inhabited. The sauropods, the long-necked, long-tailed, quadrupedal herbivores that are among the most recognizable of dinosaurs, were the largest land animals in the history of the Earth. Not in any one species. Across the entire group, which persisted for roughly 140 million years, the sauropods repeatedly evolved body sizes that no other land animal lineage has ever approached. Argentinosaurus, known from fragmentary remains from Argentina, dating to the Cretaceous, has been estimated at lengths of 30 to 40 meters and masses of 70 to 100 metric tons, depending on the reconstruction model used. To put that in context, a large African elephant, the largest land animal alive today, weighs approximately 6 metric tons. Argentinosaurus may have weighed 15 to 20 times as much. A blue whale, the largest animal that has ever lived, reaches masses of approximately 170 metric tons. Argentinosaurus was, by some estimates, more than half the mass of a blue whale on land. how? The question of how sauropods achieved such extreme body sizes has occupied paleontologists for decades, and the answer involves multiple interacting factors. Avian-style respiratory systems. Birds today have a respiratory system fundamentally different from that of mammals. Instead of lungs that simply expand and contract, bird lungs are connected to a system of air sacs that extend throughout the body cavity and into the bones themselves. This system allows air to flow through the lungs in a single direction continuously, rather than in and out, as in mammal lungs, achieving much more efficient oxygen extraction per breath. The bones of sauropods show pneumatization and the presence of internal air spaces that is remarkably similar to what we see in bird bones. The vertebrae of large sauropods are not solid bone. They are lightweight structures with complex internal architecture, full of air spaces that reduce their mass while maintaining structural integrity. This respiratory efficiency meant that sauropods could sustain the metabolic demands of enormous bodies more effectively than mammals, which is one reason why no mammal has ever approached sauropod sizes, rapid growth rates. Bone histology, the study of the microscopic structure of fossilized bone, has revealed that sauropods grew extraordinarily fast, at rates comparable to modern large mammals and far faster than modern reptiles. A large sauropod may have reached its adult size in 20 to 40 years, fast enough that the energy cost of growth was manageable, slow enough that the individual animal could accumulate the necessary resources, efficient digestion without chewing. Sauropods did not chew their food. Their teeth, simple, peg-like structures in most species, were used to strip vegetation from plants, not to process it. The food went into the gut largely unchewed, where the long digestive tract and, in many species, gastroliths, stones swallowed deliberately and retained in the digestive system, helped break it down. This meant that the skull could be relatively small and light, appropriate for an animal that needed to carry its head at the end of a very long neck without excessive muscular effort. The enormous digestive processing happened in the trunk, not in the head, the long neck itself. The necks of sauropods are among the most extraordinary structures in the history of vertebrate life. The neck of Mamenchisaurus, a Jurassic sauropod from China, reached lengths of up to 15 meters, roughly half the animal's total body length. What was this neck for? The traditional answer, and that it allowed the animal to reach high into the tree canopy for leaves, has been challenged and revised repeatedly. The biomechanics of the longest neck suggest that holding them horizontally, sweeping a wide arc of feeding territory without moving the body, may have been more energetically efficient than holding them vertically. Different sauropod species may have used their necks differently, accessing different feeding niches. High browsers and low browsers coexisting in the same ecosystem by occupying different vertical zones. What did a sauropod herd actually look like moving across the Jurassic landscape? The trackway evidence, the fossilized footprints left by sauropods moving across ancient mudflats, gives us some information. Multiple trackways from the same site sometimes show parallel tracks, suggesting that these animals traveled in groups. The spacing between footprints gives information about speed. Most sauropod trackways suggest walking gaits, not running. The footprints themselves are remarkable. A large sauropod footprint, the circular impression left by a front foot, the more oval impression of a hind foot, can be a meter or more in diameter. Walking across soft ground, a sauropod herd would have left an impression on the landscape that persisted for years. The compression of soil by tens of thousands of kilograms of animal repeated across the same ground repeatedly would have created features, paths, wallows, bare areas that influenced the vegetation and the hydrology of the landscape. Sauropods were ecosystem engineers. not deliberately. Simply by existing, by moving and eating and defecating on a massive scale, they altered the landscape around them in ways that affected every other organism in the community. The carnivorous dinosaurs, i.e. the theropods, the bipedal predators that ranged in size from the chicken-sized Microraptor to the multi-ton Tyrannosaurus, have received the most attention of any dinosaur group and the least accurate. The popular image of the great theropod predator is an animal that is essentially a living weapon, a machine for killing whose entire existence is organized around the moment of predation, whose character is defined by violence and appetite. This is not biology, it is drama. Real predators, the lions and wolves and eagles of the modern world, spend the vast majority of their time doing things other than hunting. They sleep, they groom, they play, they maintain social relationships, they avoid injury because injury to a predator can be fatal. A lion with a broken leg starves, a wolf with an infected wound dies slowly. Theropod dinosaurs were real predators in the biological sense. They had the same fundamental challenges that all predators face, acquiring enough energy to sustain a large, active body, avoiding injury in the dangerous process of subduing prey, competing with other predators for access to food, reproducing successfully. The evidence that paleontology has accumulated about theropod biology in recent decades is far more interesting than anything popular culture has managed to convey. Tyrannosaurus rex, the most famous animal in the history of paleontology, and one of the most misunderstood. The first thing to understand about T. rex is its size in context. T. rex lived in the latest Cretaceous, approximately 68 to 66 million years ago, in the final 2 million years before the end Cretaceous extinction. It lived in what is now the western United States and Canada, the fossil-rich formations of Montana, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Alberta. It was large, undeniably, genuinely T-large. A large T. rex, specimens like Sue, the famous skeleton at the Field Museum in Chicago, reached lengths of approximately 12 meters and masses of perhaps 8 to 9 metric tons. But T. rex was not the largest theropod. Spinosaurus, an extraordinary animal from the Cretaceous of North Africa, reached lengths of perhaps 14 to 15 meters, though its mass was probably similar to or less than that of T. rex due to its different body proportions. Giganotosaurus from South America and Carcharodontosaurus from Africa were also comparable to T. rex in overall size. The second thing to understand about T. rex is its arms. The tiny forelimbs of T. rex, one of the most commented upon features of the animal, the subject of endless jokes, were not vestigial. They were not evolutionary mistakes. They were functional structures, powerfully muscled despite their small size, capable of exerting substantial force. What were they for? The most recent biomechanical analyses suggest that the forelimbs of T. rex were used in close contact feeding, holding struggling prey against the body, while the jaws did the primary work. The extreme shortness of the arms may have been an adaptation that prevented them from being in the way during the primary killing behavior, which was jaw-based. The jaws of T. rex were its primary weapon, and they were extraordinary. The teeth were not blade-like and knife-edged as in many other theropods. They were robust, conical, described by one paleontologist as lethal bananas. They were designed not to slice but to crush, to pierce bone and extract the marrow. Bite force analyses based on the structure of the skull and the jaw muscles suggest that T. rex had the most powerful bite of any known terrestrial predator. Bite marks on T. rex era bones, deep gouges that could only have been made by the teeth of a very large animal, confirm that T. rex regularly bit through bone. Feathers. This is the aspect of theropod biology that popular culture has been slowest to incorporate, despite the fact that the scientific evidence for it has been overwhelming for more than 2 decades. Many theropod dinosaurs had feathers. not scales. Feathers. The evidence comes from multiple sources. Sinosauropteryx, a small theropod from the early Cretaceous of China, exquisitely preserved in fine-grained lake sediments that captured soft tissue details, shows a covering of simple, filamentous protofeathers across its body. Eutyrannus, a relative of T. rex from the early Cretaceous of China, larger than any other feathered dinosaur known, shows similar integumentary filaments. These were not the complex, aerodynamically functional feathers of modern birds. They were simpler structures, filaments, hair-like or down-like, providing insulation. But they were feathers in the developmental and structural sense, produced by the same types of follicles that produce modern bird feathers. Whether T. rex itself had feathers, or whether feathers were lost in the largest theropods as body size increased, since large bodies retain heat more efficiently and insulation becomes less useful, is still debated. Some paleontologists think adult T. rex was largely scale-covered, based on skin impression fossils, but may have had feathers in specific areas or as juveniles. What is not debated is that the theropod group as a whole had the genetic and developmental machinery to produce feathers. The small feathered theropods of the Cretaceous, Velociraptor, Deinonychus, Microraptor, were covered in feathers. Some of them could glide or fly. The boundary between non-avian dinosaurs and birds is not a sharp line, it is a gradient, and the organisms along that gradient, from the small, feathered dinosaurs of the Cretaceous to the early birds like Archaeopteryx, show the gradual accumulation of the features we associate with flight and with birdhood distributed across a spectrum of related animals. The question that paleontology has struggled with most productively in the last 30 years is not what dinosaurs look like. The bones tell us that with increasing precision, but how they behaved. Behavior does not fossilize. You cannot find a fossilized courtship display, a fossilized parent-offspring interaction, a fossilized territorial dispute. What you can find are the physical traces that behavior leaves on the bodies and environments of animals. And from those traces, with appropriate caution, inferences about behavior can be made. Parental care. The discovery at Egg Mountain in Montana in the 1970s and 1980s, a nesting site of the Hadrosaur maiasaura, meaning good mother lizard, was one of the most significant behavioral revelations in the history of paleontology. The nests at Egg Mountain were not simply clutches of eggs. They showed evidence of extended parental attention. The eggshells were crushed and trampled in ways suggesting that hatchlings remained in the nest after emerging, something that only makes sense if adults were bringing food to the nest. The bones of hatchlings at the site showed incompletely ossified joints, suggesting that they were not yet capable of sustained independent locomotion and were dependent on parental provisioning. Maiasaura, the evidence suggested, was a caring parent, not simply laying eggs and abandoning them to chance, but actively tending its young during the vulnerable early phase of their lives. This finding has been supplemented by discoveries across many dinosaur groups. Oviraptorid dinosaurs, small to medium-sized theropods with distinctive crested skulls, have been found preserved in brooding position over their nests, arms spread in a posture that exactly mirrors the brooding posture of modern birds. These animals were keeping their eggs warm, protecting them from predators, maintaining the nest, precisely the parental behaviors we see in living archosaurs. Social behavior. The evidence for dinosaur sociality comes primarily from two sources: bone beds and trackways. Bone beds, accumulations of multiple individuals of the same species in the same rock unit, suggest that at least some dinosaurs died together, which in turn suggests that they lived together. Ceratopsian bone beds, accumulations of dozens or hundreds of individuals of species like Centrosaurus, have been interpreted as the preserved remnants of herds that were caught in catastrophic events, floods or droughts that killed many animals simultaneously. Trackways, parallel sets of footprints from multiple individuals moving in the same direction, similarly suggest group movement. Sauropod trackways from several sites show multiple parallel trails of similar size, suggesting that groups of animals were walking together in the same direction at the same time. The inference that at least some dinosaurs were social animals, traveling in groups possibly with some degree of coordinated behavior, is supported by this evidence. The specifics of dinosaur social structure remain largely unknown, but the baseline evidence for aggregation behavior is solid. Display structures. The elaborate bony structures of many dinosaur skulls, the crests of the hadrosaurs, the frills of the ceratopsians, the horns that appeared in many different dinosaur lineages, have generated enormous debate about their function. The traditional interpretation was defensive, that the horns of Triceratops, for example, were weapons against predators. But the geometry of most horn arrangements, angled in ways that would make them more effective in intraspecific contests than in defense against predators, and the evidence from pathologies, injuries on horn cores consistent with contact between individuals, suggests that the primary function of many of these structures was intraspecific display and combat. Triceratops fought other Triceratops. The horns were used to establish dominance, to win mates, to defend territory against rivals. The frill, the large bony structure behind the skull, may have been used in visual display, possibly flush with blood or covered in colorful skin in life, amplifying the visual signal. Hadrosaur crests, the elaborate hollow structures on the skulls of species like Parasaurolophus, have been shown through computer modeling to have functioned as resonating chambers, producing low-frequency sounds when air was forced through them. Parasaurolophus was a sound-producing animal, communicating with conspecifics through acoustic signals that may have been complex enough to convey specific information. The dinosaur world was not silent. It was full of sound, the low resonance of hadrosaur calls, the impact sounds of ceratopsians in combat, the vocalizations of theropods communicating with each other and with their young. Approximately 130 million years ago in the early Cretaceous, something happened to the plant world that would ultimately change everything. The first flowering plants evolved. The angiosperm, the group that today includes virtually every crop plant, every garden flower, every grassland, every hardwood forest, every fruit tree, appeared first as small, weedy plants in the understory of Cretaceous forests. They were not impressive. They did not immediately dominate. For tens of millions of years, they remained a minor component of ecosystems still dominated by gymnosperms. But they had something. They had the flower. The flower is not primarily a beautiful object, though beauty is how we most often think of it. The flower is a deal, a bargain struck between a plant and an animal, usually an insect, in which the plant provides food, nectar, pollen, in exchange for the animal carrying pollen from one flower to another, achieving cross-fertilization at distances and with a precision that wind pollination, the gymnosperm's method, cannot match. This deal, this co-evolutionary relationship between flowering plants and their pollinators, is one of the most productive partnerships in the history of life. It drove an extraordinary diversification of both parties, more flower forms, more pollinator forms, more flower forms again, in a spiral of mutual adaptation that produced the astounding diversity of flowering plants and insects that characterizes modern ecosystems. By the late Cretaceous, the last 30 million years before the extinction, flowering plants were becoming dominant across many ecosystems. The world was beginning to look more familiar. The forest understory was filling with flowering plants. Some open habitats were beginning to be colonized by low-growing angiosperms that prefigured the later evolution of grasses. This change in the plant world had consequences for the dinosaurs. New plant resources meant new ecological opportunities. The hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs, the most diverse and abundant large herbivores of the late Cretaceous, had dental batteries of extraordinary sophistication, hundreds of small, tightly packed teeth constantly replaced throughout life, forming a grinding surface capable of processing the tough, fibrous plant material of angiosperm leaves and stems with an efficiency that earlier dinosaur herbivores could not match. The hadrosaurs were, in a meaningful sense, a response to the angiosperms. They evolved the tools to exploit the new plant resources that the flowering plant revolution was making available. The ceratopsians, Triceratops and its relatives, similarly had dental batteries designed for cutting through tough plant material. They were processors of vegetation, efficient consumers of the new Cretaceous plant world. The late Cretaceous was not a world in decline, as it is sometimes characterized, as if the extinction was somehow inevitable, as if the dinosaur ecosystems were already fading when the asteroid arrived. It was a world of extraordinary biological richness and complexity, with diverse and productive ecosystems, large and varied dinosaur faunas, and the beginning of the flowering plant revolution that would ultimately produce the world we live in. The dinosaurs were not failing when they ended, they were thriving. For most of the 20th century, dinosaurs were understood as reptiles in the traditional sense, cold-blooded, ectothermic, dependent on external heat sources to warm their bodies and power their muscles. Big, scaly lizards, slow, lumbering, waiting for the sun to warm them before they could move. This understanding shaped everything about how dinosaurs were depicted: the sluggish sauropods, the slow-moving predators, the animals that seemed barely awake. It was wrong. The revolution in understanding dinosaur physiology began in the 1970s with the work of paleontologist Robert Bakker, who argued, on the basis of anatomical evidence, ecological evidence, and bone histology, that dinosaurs were not cold-blooded in the reptilian sense, but were instead endothermic, capable of generating their own body heat through metabolic processes, like modern birds and mammals. Bakker's arguments were controversial. They challenged a century of established understanding. They required reinterpreting large amounts of evidence, but the evidence accumulated, and what it showed was that the simple dichotomy between warm-blooded, mammalian, avian, and cold-blooded, reptilian, was itself an oversimplification, that the metabolic spectrum is more complex than these categories suggest, and that dinosaurs occupied a position on that spectrum that was distinctly their own. Bone histology, of the microscopic examination of dinosaur bone structure, was the most powerful line of evidence. Modern reptiles grow slowly and show lines of arrested growth in their bones, annual growth rings like tree rings, marking the periods of winter when growth slowed or stopped. Modern birds and mammals grow rapidly and show a different bone texture, highly vascularized, with the complex internal structure characteristic of fast growth. Dinosaur bones, examined under the microscope, look more like bird and mammal bones than like reptile bones. They are highly vascularized, they show rapid growth, and many, though not all, show the growth rings of slower cold seasons. But the growth between those rings is fast, not the slow reptilian growth. This suggests that dinosaurs were neither simply cold-blooded nor simply warm-blooded in the mammalian sense. They appear to have had elevated metabolic rates, faster than modern reptiles, capable of sustaining more active lifestyles. But their thermoregulation was achieved partly through the thermal inertia of large bodies. A very large animal retains heat more efficiently than a small one, and partly through physiological processes that may not have been identical to either modern reptiles or modern mammals. The term mesothermy, intermediate metabolic regulation, has been proposed for the dinosaurian condition, though the specifics vary considerably across the group. Small, active theropods were almost certainly fully endothermic. Birds are their direct descendants, and birds are endothermic. Large sauropods may have relied more heavily on thermal inertia. their enormous mass-retaining body heat without the metabolic cost of full endothermy. What is clear is that the image of the slow, torpid, sun-dependent dinosaur is wrong. Dinosaurs were active animals. They grew fast. They moved purposefully. They were capable of sustained activity in ways that their reptilian heritage would not predict. They were, in this and in many other ways, something genuinely new. Not simply large reptiles, not proto-birds, but a distinct biological category that occupied ecological space and metabolic space in ways that had no precise equivalent before or after. One of the most startling findings of recent paleontology is the discovery of abundant dinosaur fossils in what were, during the Mesozoic, polar regions. Not near the poles. At the poles. During the Cretaceous period, the Arctic and Antarctic regions of the Earth were not ice-covered. The global climate was warm enough that the polar regions, while cold and dark in winter, were habitable, covered with forests of conifers and other vegetation, populated by complex ecosystems, and in those polar ecosystems, dinosaurs. The Prince Creek Formation of northern Alaska, located above the Arctic Circle at latitudes that today are frozen tundra for most of the year, has yielded a diverse dinosaur fauna including hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, small theropods, and ankylosaurs. These animals were living at latitudes where, even in the warm Cretaceous climate, the winter would have brought months of darkness and temperatures well below freezing. The implications are significant. Either these dinosaurs migrated seasonally, moving southward in autumn to escape the polar winter and returning in spring, or they overwintered at high latitudes, surviving the dark, cold months in place. The evidence for migration is mixed. Some large herbivores might have been capable of the long-distance movements that seasonal migration would require, but the polar faunas include small animals that would have faced extraordinary challenges on a 1,000-kilometer migration. The evidence for overwintering, for dinosaurs surviving the polar winter in place, is increasingly compelling. This would require the animals to be endothermic enough to maintain body temperature in cold conditions, to have access to enough food through the winter, and to be behaviorally capable of managing the months of darkness. The polar dinosaur fauna tells us that dinosaurs were remarkably adaptable animals, capable of surviving at the physiological and ecological margins of their world in ways that the image of the warm climate, tropically adapted reptile cannot accommodate. They were not fragile, they were resilient, which makes what eventually happened to them all the more striking. This is the part of the story that popular culture consistently gets wrong, and that matters most for understanding what dinosaurs actually were. Birds are dinosaurs, not like dinosaurs, not descended from dinosaurs, not relatives of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, members of the clade Dinosauria, as fully as T-Rex or Triceratops or Brachiosaurus. The classification is not a metaphor, it is a phylogenetic statement, a claim about the branching history of life that is supported by more evidence than almost any other claim in vertebrate paleontology. The evidence for the dinosaurian identity of birds begins with anatomy. Archaeopteryx, the famous feathered animal from the late Jurassic limestone of Bavaria, discovered in 1861 and immediately recognized as extraordinary, was the first clear demonstration that birds and dinosaurs were closely related. It had feathers, clearly avian, it had wings, but it also had teeth, clawed fingers on its wings, and a long bony tail, features of its dinosaurian ancestry not yet lost in the transition to full birdhood. In the century and a half since Archaeopteryx, the fossil record of the dinosaur-bird transition has been enormously enriched. Dozens of species have been described: Microraptor, Anchiornis, Sapionis, Confuciusornis, and many others. that fill in the gradual transition between the small, feathered theropods of the Cretaceous and the modern bird body plan. The transition was not a sudden jump. It was a gradual accumulation of features: feathers, wishbone, reduced fingers, modified feet, keel-bearing breastbone, across many generations in a lineage of small theropods that was exploring the ecological space between the terrestrial and the aerial. And the key insight is this: the extinction that ended the Mesozoic era did not end the dinosaurs. It ended the non-avian dinosaurs, the great diversity of forms that we normally think of when we think of dinosaurs. But the avian dinosaurs, the birds, survived. They survived the impact winter. They survived the collapse of the food chains that followed. They survived, we think, because their small size and their metabolic efficiency, and perhaps their ability to eat seeds, a food source that persisted through the post-impact darkness, allowed them to persist when the larger animals could not. And then, in the aftermath, they diversified. The Cenozoic era, of the 66 million years since the extinction, has been an age of birds as much as it has been an age of mammals. The approximately 10,000 species of birds alive today represent an evolutionary radiation of extraordinary diversity, from the ostrich to the hummingbird, from the albatross to the penguin, from the eagle to the sparrow. Every one of these animals is a dinosaur. The pigeon you see in the street, the sparrow on the garden fence, the eagle circling on a thermal above a mountain, the penguin waddling across an Antarctic ice sheet, all dinosaurs. When you hear birds singing in the morning, the sound that has accompanied human life for as long as humans have existed, you are hearing dinosaurs. The most ancient and most successful lineage of land vertebrates, still here, still singing, still finding ways to fill the world with life. The dinosaurs did not disappear. They changed. On a day approximately 66 million years ago, a day that was, up to the moment of impact, entirely ordinary, a rock fell from the sky. Not a small rock. An object approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter, the size of a city, moving at approximately 20 kilometers per second. An asteroid, most likely, though the possibility that it was a comet fragment has not been entirely excluded. It struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico in the shallow waters of a continental shelf. The impact site is called Chicxulub, named for the town nearest to its center, and it is one of the most studied geological features on Earth. The immediate effects of the impact were catastrophic on a regional scale. The energy released by the impact was equivalent to approximately 1 billion nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. The rock and sediment of the impact site was vaporized and thrown into the atmosphere. The shock wave traveled through the Earth, triggering earthquakes along every fault line simultaneously. The blast wave through the air flattened forests across the entire Gulf of Mexico region. The thermal pulse from the impact ignited wildfires across much of North America. A tsunami, or rather a series of tsunamis of extraordinary scale, radiated outward from the impact site, crossing the Gulf of Mexico and reaching coastlines thousands of kilometers away. All of this happened within hours of the impact, but the regional destruction, as catastrophic as it was not what killed the dinosaurs. What killed the dinosaurs was what came next. The billions of tons of material thrown into the upper atmosphere by the impact, rock dust, sulfur compounds from the vaporized sediments of the impact site, soot from the global wildfires, spread around the Earth. Within days, the global atmosphere was loaded with particulate matter sufficient to dramatically reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the surface. Photosynthesis stopped. Not everywhere, not permanently, but across most of the Earth's surface, for months to years, the light levels dropped below what plants needed to photosynthesize. The primary producers, the plants that converted solar energy into biological energy, largely failed. Without photosynthesis, the food chains that depended on plants collapsed. The herbivores that ate plants starved. The carnivores that ate the herbivores starved. The decomposers that broke down dead organic matter, the fungi and bacteria, were for a time the most biologically productive organisms on Earth. The larger the animal, the more food it needed, and the more vulnerable it was to a collapse in food supply. A large sauropod weighing 50 metric tons needed enormous quantities of food every day. In a world where photosynthesis had collapsed and the vegetation was dying, there was no food to be had. The small animals, and the ones that could subsist on seeds, on insects, on the material that decomposers were producing, on whatever was available in the detritus of the dying ecosystem, had a chance. The birds survived probably partly because of their small size and partly because many of them were adapted to eating seeds which can persist without photosynthesis, dormant in the soil for months or years. The small mammals survived for similar reasons. The non-avian dinosaurs did not. There is a detail about the Chicxulub impact that deserves to be stated carefully. The asteroid did not arrive in a dying world. The late Cretaceous ecosystems were diverse and productive. There is evidence for some volcanic activity in what is now India. The Deccan Traps, a massive volcanic province that was erupting around the same time as the impact, that may have been contributing to some environmental stress before the impact. The details of this pre-impact environment are still being studied and debated, but the fundamental finding of modern paleontology is clear. The extinction was sudden on geological timescales, it was global, and it correlates precisely with the Chicxulub impact. The asteroid killed the dinosaurs, not gradually, not through slow decline, but in the aftermath of a single catastrophic event that disrupted the global climate system with a speed and thoroughness that the non-avian dinosaurs could not survive. It was, in the most literal sense, bad luck. Had the asteroid arrived a few million years earlier or later, or in a different location, striking rock with a different composition that produced less atmospheric sulfur, the outcome might have been different. The non-avian dinosaurs had survived multiple other extinction events across their 165 million year history. They were resilient. They had proven capable of recovering from environmental disruption repeatedly. The Chicxulub impact was simply too large, too sudden, and too global. In the years and decades after the impact, the Earth was a different place. The dinosaurs, the great non-avian forms, were gone. The large marine reptiles, the mosasaurs and the plesiosaurs, were gone. The pterosaurs, the flying reptiles that had shared the Mesozoic skies with the early birds, were gone. The world was quieter, emptier. The ecological roles that these animals had filled, the large herbivore niche, the apex predator niche, the aerial predator niche, were vacant. And into those vacant niches, over the tens of millions of years that followed, the mammals expanded. The mammals had been present throughout the Mesozoic era. Small, largely nocturnal, mostly insectivorous animals that occupied the ecological margins of a world dominated by dinosaurs. They had diversified somewhat across the Mesozoic, but they had never achieved the ecological dominance or the body sizes of the dinosaurs. In the aftermath of the extinction, they began to. Within 10 million years of the extinction, mammals had achieved body sizes approaching those of the smallest dinosaurs. Within 20 million years, the first large herbivorous mammals appeared. Within 50 million years, the first whales, returning to the sea from a terrestrial mammalian ancestor, were present in the fossil record. The Cenozoic era, the 66 million years of the post-dinosaur world, is in many ways the story of mammals filling the ecological space that the dinosaurs had occupied. Large herbivores, large carnivores, aerial animals, aquatic animals. The same broad ecological roles filled by different animals with different biology. But the dinosaurs had not simply left empty space. They had structured the world in ways that persisted. The flowering plants, whose great diversification began in the Cretaceous in interaction with the dinosaur ecosystems of that period, continued to diversify in the Cenozoic. The co-evolutionary relationships between angiosperms and their pollinators and seed dispersers intensified and elaborated. The grasses, a group of flowering plants that appears in the fossil record in the Eocene roughly 50 million years ago, eventually came to dominate the open landscapes of the world, producing the grassland ecosystems that are among the most productive on Earth. The insects, the pollinators, the decomposers, the predators, the prey, continued the diversification that had begun in the Mesozoic. And the birds, the dinosaur survivors, continued to fill the skies, taking on ecological roles that the pterosaurs had occupied and inventing new ones, reaching every continent and every habitat, becoming the most species-rich group of terrestrial vertebrates. The world we inhabit today is the world that the dinosaurs built, continued by the organisms that survived them. The oxygen we breathe was produced, in part, by the photosynthesis of plants that evolved in the dinosaur-dominated world. The soil that grows our food was enriched, in part, by the biological activity of the Mesozoic ecosystems. The birds that share our world are their living representatives. We live in the aftermath of the dinosaur world, and the dinosaur world lives in us. In the birds, in the structure of our ecosystems, in the chemical composition of our atmosphere. The 66 million years of geological time that separate us from the last non-avian dinosaur is an enormous span by any human measure, but the connection is real, physical, and continuous. Everything that has been said in this documentary rests on a single question. How do we know? The dinosaurs are gone, their behavior cannot be observed, their soft tissues, their colors, their sounds, their social interactions, are largely inaccessible. What we have are bones, sometimes skin impressions, sometimes eggs and nests and trackways. How do you reconstruct a living animal from its mineralized remains? The science of paleontology has developed a sophisticated toolkit for exactly this challenge, and it is worth spending time on the methods, because understanding how the science works changes the way you understand the findings. Comparative anatomy is the foundation. Living animals provide the framework. The bones of a modern bird tell us where muscles attached, how the animal moved, what its metabolic rate required. A dinosaur bone analyzed through the same framework yields inferences about the living animal, where muscles attached, how the joint moved, what forces the bone was designed to withstand. The limits of this method are clear. We can only make inferences where living analogues exist, where dinosaurs were doing something with no modern equivalent. The extreme body sizes of sauropods, the elaborate head structures of ceratopsians. The comparative method has to be applied more cautiously. Bone histology, the analysis of bone microstructure, has been one of the most productive methods of the last 3 decades. Cut a thin section of dinosaur bone, look at it under a microscope, and you can read information about how fast the animal grew, whether it was growing when it died, how old it was, what seasonal signals its life history recorded. This method has transformed our understanding of dinosaur growth rates and metabolic strategies. It is not without its complications. Preservation can alter bone texture, and interpreting the histological signal requires expertise and caution. But in the hands of skilled practitioners, it yields remarkable insights. Molecular paleontology is the newest and most contested frontier. The claim, first made by paleontologist Mary Schweitzer in the 1990s and developed into a productive research program over the following decades, that some dinosaur bones preserve not just mineralized tissue, but actual original biological molecules, has been controversial and is still debated. Schweitzer's team has identified what they claim are collagen fragments, the protein that forms the structural scaffold of bone in dinosaur specimens tens of millions of years old. If these findings are confirmed, they open extraordinary possibilities. The molecular data in preserved collagen could provide information about dinosaur physiology, diet, and evolutionary relationships that no anatomical analysis can yield. The debate about the reality and significance of these findings continues among paleontologists. It is exactly the kind of productive scientific controversy that drives a field forward. CT scanning, computed tomography, the same medical imaging technology used in hospitals, allows paleontologists to examine the internal structure of fossils without cutting them open. The hollow chambers inside sauropod vertebrae, the internal structure of dinosaur skulls, the development of bones within eggs, all of these have been studied through CT scanning with results that would have been impossible through destructive sectioning. And phylogenetics, the quantitative analysis of evolutionary relationships, provides the theoretical framework within which all the other methods are interpreted. Every inference about dinosaur biology is made in the context of an understanding of where that dinosaur sits in the evolutionary tree, what its relatives tell us, what the ancestral condition of its group was, and how its features departed from or resembled those of its relatives. The science of paleontology is not simply finding bones and putting them in museums. It is a sophisticated analytical enterprise using the tools of chemistry, physics, biology, and mathematics to extract information from the most fragmentary evidence. Every confident statement about dinosaur biology rests on an inference from evidence. The quality of that inference varies. Some things we know with high confidence, others are genuinely uncertain. The best paleontologists are transparent about this distinction, marking the frontier between what the evidence clearly shows and what remains speculative. The picture they have collectively assembled of active, warm, complex, socially sophisticated animals occupying an extraordinarily diverse world for 165 million years is not a story invented from imagination. It is a story extracted painstakingly and brilliantly from the rocks go back to the dawn, that silence before the light, that particular quality of darkness just before the first bird begins. And then the first bird begins. That sound, that single bird calling into the pre-dawn dark, is 66 million years of survival. It is the descendant of an animal that lived through the most catastrophic day in the history of complex life, that found enough to eat in the ruins of the old world, that raised its young through the years of impact winter, that persisted and diversified and eventually filled the sky of a new world. It is a dinosaur singing. Every morning the dinosaurs announce that they survived. The bones in the museums, the great mounted skeletons of T-Rex and Brachiosaurus and Triceratops, are not the end of the dinosaur story. They are a chapter, a long, extraordinary, incomprehensibly rich chapter of 165 million years, during which these animals explored nearly every ecological role available to a large land vertebrate, built the most productive and diverse terrestrial ecosystems the Earth had seen since the Cambrian, and ultimately gave rise to the lineage that is, today, the most species-rich group of terrestrial vertebrates on the planet. The non-avian dinosaurs are gone. The asteroid saw to that. But the dinosaurs are not gone. They are in the trees outside your window, moving in the first light of morning, preparing to announce another day. They are in the swallows that arrived with the spring and will leave with the autumn, covering thousands of kilometers on wings that are the modified forelimbs of theropod dinosaurs. They are in the penguins standing on the Antarctic ice, warm-blooded, feathered, the descendants of animals that survived the worst extinction in the last 250 million years. They are everywhere. 165 million years of dinosaur evolution did not end with the asteroid. It continued. It is continuing now. In the bird that is beginning to sing outside, in the darkness just before dawn. Rest now. The Earth is still turning, the same Earth the dinosaurs walked for 165 million years, the same sky their descendants fill with song. And somewhere in the morning light, a bird is lifting from a branch. A dinosaur, still here, still singing good night.